Kathy, step back right now, are you crazy? The piercing scream of my father, Robert White, ripped through the solemn silence of the Defense Convention Center lobby. His hand clamped down on my arm like a vice. I felt his fingernails dig directly into the heavy wool of my dress uniform, scraping against my skin. He yanked me backward with violent force. His eyes were wide, bulging with sheer, unadulterated panic as he pointed a shaking finger at the heavily armored, pitch-black SUV rolling into the classified security perimeter. "Don't touch that!" he roared, his voice cracking with terror. "That's a general's vehicle. The military police will handcuff you and throw you in a cell right now. Stay away from it, you brat." A few elite security officers nearby frowned, hands hovering over their radios. Dozens of high-ranking military officials turned their heads, their eyes locking onto us. Right there, in the epicenter of national defense, my own flesh and blood was treating me like a stray disease-ridden dog about to ruin a master's banquet. He honestly truly believed I was a pathetic parasite who was about to commit a federal crime by stepping out of my lowly place. I looked at the armored vehicle. I looked at my father's sweating, terrified face. Then I slowly reached into the pocket of my dress uniform. It was time to end this delusion. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I learned the meaning of discipline long before I ever picked up a rifle. At 17, I woke up on the morning of my enlistment to the sound of my father yelling at the television in the living room. Some football team had blown a fourth-quarter lead. He slammed his beer can on the coffee table, and the aluminum crunch echoed down the hallway into my bedroom. I had spent the entire previous night packing a single duffel bag with everything I owned, which wasn't much. 3 pairs of jeans, 2 clean shirts, a toothbrush, and a dog-eared pocket Bible my grandmother had given me before she died. He hadn't noticed the bag sitting by my bedroom door. He hadn't noticed the bare walls where I'd taken down my posters. He hadn't noticed that his daughter was leaving home for good. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a full 10 seconds waiting for him to look up. He didn't. He was ripping open a bag of chips. I cleared my throat and told him I was leaving for the recruiting office to sign my enlistment papers. He set the chips on his lap, took a sip of his lukewarm coffee from the mug on the side table, and scoffed without making eye contact. "Joining the military has a decent pension, I guess, but don't make a fool of yourself." Not a single ounce of pride. Not a question about where I would be stationed or what branch I had chosen or when he would see me again. He turned back to the television. I picked up my duffel bag, walked out the front door, and drove myself to the recruiter's office in a rusted sedan with a cracked windshield and no air conditioning. The passenger seat was covered in fast food wrappers that weren't mine. I sat in that cramped, overly air-conditioned recruiting office and stared at the enlistment contract. The metallic smell of the recruiter's ink pen hung in the stale air. A faded American flag drooped from a plastic stand in the corner. The recruiter was a staff sergeant with a flat-top haircut and a firm handshake. He looked me in the eye when he spoke. Nobody in my house had looked me in the eye in years. I didn't sign the contract out of some naive, cinematic dream of being a hero. I signed it because I was starving for a transparent structure. I wanted a world where blood, sweat, and tactical efficiency were the only currencies that mattered. No favoritism, no gaslighting. You either meet the standard or you get out. I pressed the pen to the paper, and the recruiter smiled. He told me I was making a decision that would change my life. He was the first adult to say something to me that day that wasn't a complaint, a dismissal, or a grunt. I signed every line, initialed every box, and handed the contract back across the desk. He shook my hand again and told me to report in 3 weeks. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat in the car for 15 minutes. My father never came outside to ask where I had been. I secured my escape from a house where my existence was less important than a blown football lead. The following years were defined by my absence. I told my family I was on routine deployments. In reality, I was leading life-or-death operations in the most unforgiving combat zones on the planet. My boots hit the dirt in places that don't appear on civilian maps. I ate meals out of foil pouches in vehicles that shook from nearby mortar impacts. I learned to sleep with one eye scanning for threats. And every single month, I funneled massive amounts of hazard pay and military investment returns straight into my father's bank account. I set up the direct deposit myself during my first tour, sitting on a cot in a plywood barracks, filling out the banking forms by flashlight. I told myself it was the right thing to do. He was my father. He needed the money. I sat in a dusty tent in Fallujah, picking sand out of my gear, pulling grit from the bolt carrier group of my rifle, while he used my blood money to buy a top-of-the-line luxury sedan. A sleek, black leather interior German import. He needed it to maintain his facade among his country club friends. He needed them to believe he was a man of means, a man of consequence. He took the money eagerly. He deposited every single check without once asking where it came from or what it cost me to earn it. He never once asked what I had to do to earn those checks. He never asked how many firefights I survived or how many of my brothers and sisters in arms I had to load onto medevac choppers while their blood soaked through my gloves. He never asked about the night I held Sergeant Diaz's hand while she bled out in the back of a transport vehicle that couldn't reach the field hospital in time. He never asked about the ringing in my ears that still hasn't stopped or the scars I covered with long sleeves, so civilians wouldn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. He never asked why I flinched at fireworks or why I slept with the light on. He didn't care. The deposit cleared and that was sufficient. I chose to stay silent. In the military, humility keeps you alive. The loudest soldier in the room is usually the first one in a body bag. I kept my achievements locked away in classified files and quiet nods from my superiors. I thought my financial support would earn a baseline level of respect. I thought that if I gave him enough, he might one day look at me and see something worth acknowledging. I was wrong. My silence became the very weapon he used to crush me. He interpreted my lack of bragging as proof of my mediocrity. He drove the car I paid for, wore the suits my combat pay funded, and began to construct a narrative where he was a brilliant financial mind taking care of a slow-witted daughter who couldn't hack it in the real world. He told his friends he helped me manage my money. He told his country club buddies that I was lucky he guided me into the military because I had no other options. He rewrote my entire life story with himself as the hero and me as the burden. At a neighborhood barbecue, I overheard him tell a group of men that he practically raised me by himself and that I would be nothing without his guidance. He was holding a stake that my combat pay had purchased standing in a backyard that my direct deposits had maintained, wearing shoes I'd ordered for his birthday from a base exchange overseas. I stood behind the screen door listening, my hand gripping the aluminum frame until my knuckles ached. I said nothing. I went back inside and washed the dishes. I came home on leave one Thanksgiving and watched him polish the hood of that luxury sedan in the driveway, running a chamois cloth over the chrome trim with the loving attention he had never once given me. He was completely oblivious to the explosive residue that permanently stained the calluses on my hands, the hands that paid for his entire life. Time moved relentlessly. I pinned on the silver bars of a captain after completing a tactical leadership program that less than 4% of candidates survive. Then the gold oak leaves of a major handed to me by a brigadier general who shook my hand and told me I was the finest officer he'd ever recommended for promotion. Then the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel, a rank most career soldiers never reach. Every promotion came with more responsibility, more classified operations, more weight on my shoulders, and more silence from the one person whose voice I still irrationally craved. The day I made lieutenant colonel, I called home from a secure line at a forward operating base. The connection crackled with static. I had just returned from a mission that earned me a classified commendation so sensitive that the citation itself was stored in a vault. For reasons I still cannot explain, I wanted to hear my father's voice. He picked up on the 6th ring. I told him I had been promoted. There was a long pause. I could hear a game show playing on the television behind him. Then he started talking about the neighbor's new fishing boat, a 22-footer with a trolling motor. He said my Uncle David had gotten a deal on a timeshare in Florida and was going to invite him down in the spring. He talked for 4 straight minutes without acknowledging a single word I had said. When he paused to take a breath, I hung up the phone. I stared at the cinder block wall of the communications room for a long time. Then I picked up a classified folder and went back to planning the next day's convoy route. Every time I returned home on leave, my father barely glanced at my uniform. If he noticed the change in rank insignia, he aggressively ignored it. He treated my career progression the same way one might treat a child collecting meaningless merit badges at a summer camp. Once during a family dinner, my cousin asked about my new rank. My father cut in before I could answer and changed the subject to his recent property tax complaint. He physically waved his hand in front of my face, dismissing my cousin's question as if it were a fly buzzing near his food. My cousin looked down at her plate and didn't ask again. He preferred the version of me that was small, dependent, and fundamentally beneath him. That version was safe. That version didn't threaten the architecture of his ego. That version kept the hierarchy intact, and the hierarchy was the only structure he had ever successfully built. The true cruelty did not happen in private. It was a public spectacle. It happened during our annual Thanksgiving dinner. The house was packed with his aging veteran friends and arrogant neighbors. The heavy, suffocating scent of roasted turkey and stale beer filled every room. Grease spots darkened the kitchen countertops. The linoleum floor stuck to my shoes. I stood near the kitchen island, wearing a plain sweater to avoid drawing attention, holding a glass of water while everyone else clutched wine glasses and beer cans. My father walked over heavily, patting the back of his neighbor, a loud, obnoxious man named Gary, who constantly bragged about his regional sales numbers and his boat. My father clamped a heavy hand on my shoulder, physically pushing me down an inch. His fingers dug into the muscle near my neck. He pointed a half-empty beer bottle at me and smiled a wide fake smile. The kind of smile that looks warm from a distance but up close reveals nothing behind the teeth. This is my daughter. She just does some minor paperwork for the military. He didn't state my rank. He didn't state my title. He didn't mention my deployments or my commendations or the fact that I was one of the youngest lieutenant colonels in the entire armed forces. It was a perfectly calculated introduction, polite enough to avoid looking like a monster, but vague enough to completely sever me from my lifelong achievements. It was a surgical strike designed to strip my identity bare. I watched the neighbor Gary give me a pitying, dismissive nod, the kind you give to someone's underachieving kid before turning his back to me. He resumed bragging about his quarterly sales commission, and my father listened with rapt attention, nodding vigorously, laughing at every joke, pouring the man another glass of wine from a bottle I had shipped from Italy during my last overseas assignment. My father's other hand still rested on my shoulder, pressing down a physical reminder that I was to stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. I glanced across the room and caught my Uncle David watching the entire scene from the couch. He saw everything. The introduction, the dismissal, the hand on my shoulder. He took a sip of his beer and looked away. He said nothing. Nobody ever said anything. The entire family operated under an unspoken agreement that my father's ego was a structure too dangerous to challenge, and I was the designated foundation they all expected to bear the weight in silence. I assessed the room the way I assess every room. I identified the exits, counted the occupants, noted who was impaired and who was sober. Engaging in a shouting match over my resume with a group of drunk retirees offered zero tactical advantage. I let him wear my authority like a borrowed coat. I allowed him to strut around the living room, soaking up the artificial superiority, knowing full well I would eventually pack my bags and return to a world where my orders moved battalions and my signature authorized billion-dollar logistics chains. I swallowed the insult not out of weakness, but out of cold, hard discipline. Gary refilled his glass, spilled beer on the carpet, and laughed about it. My father laughed with him. I set my glass of water on the counter, walked to the guest bedroom, and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and counted my breaths. 4 in, 4 out. The same breathing pattern I used in a sniper position when the margin between life and death was a single steady exhale. I left the house before sunrise the next morning without saying goodbye to anyone. Everything worsened when I stepped into the senior leadership tier, transferring to the Pentagon to coordinate national security events. These were high-stakes military galas, classified briefings, and funding summits where a single signature could authorize a billion-dollar defense budget. Generals, admirals, intelligence directors, and foreign military attachés moved through these corridors daily. My father became obsessed. He aggressively leveraged his minor affiliation with a local veterans group, a recreational outfit that mostly organized charity golf tournaments, and demanded I get him clearance to attend. He called me 3 times in 1 week. Each call was longer and more insistent than the last. The third call lasted 45 minutes. I held the phone away from my ear while reviewing a security protocol document and let him talk himself in circles until he ran out of breath. Bringing him along was easier than spending another hour on the phone explaining why I wouldn't. I approved his security clearance without a second thought, effectively granting a ghost a golden ticket to the epicenter of global power. His behavior instantly mutated into something deeply pathological. He didn't just attend the events. He hovered around me like a paranoid shadow, as if I were a toddler wandering near a swimming pool. He constantly adjusted my posture, slapping my shoulders back if I leaned against a table. He tugged at the hem of my blazer if it bunched near my waist. If I tried to speak to an officer, he would physically step in front of me, cutting off my sightline and inserting himself into the conversation. At one reception, a formal dinner for European Command leadership, I moved to introduce myself to a 2-star general visiting from Germany. My father grabbed my elbow, pulled me back 3 steps, and whispered through clenched teeth that I was embarrassing myself. He straightened my collar with both hands, yanking it upward like he was dressing a child for Sunday church. Then he shoved me toward the appetizer table and told me to go get him a plate. I stood at that table holding a porcelain plate and stared at a row of shrimp cocktail, while a room full of the most powerful military leaders in the Western world conducted business 10 feet away from me. A colonel from the Joint Chiefs staff walked past me, recognized my face, and started to say hello. My father materialized between us like a shadow, extended his hand to the colonel first, and introduced himself as Robert White, longtime supporter of the armed forces. He positioned his body so that the colonel couldn't see me behind him. The colonel looked confused, nodded politely, and walked away. My father turned back to me with a satisfied smile, as if he had just saved me from a terrible social mistake. He picked a shrimp off the plate I was holding and popped it in his mouth. He was terrified that my mere presence near important people would somehow infect his imaginary network of elite connections. The irony was suffocating. Every person he was desperate to impress already knew my name. They read my reports. They attended my briefings. They just didn't know the nervous, hovering civilian shadowing me was my father. During a high-level briefing reception, I spotted the Air Force commanding general across the room. I needed to confirm a transport protocol with him. A simple 2-minute professional exchange. As I took a step forward, my father grabbed the back of my blazer with a fistful of fabric, yanking me behind a decorative marble pillar. He leaned in close, his breath reeking of gin, and hissed, "That's the Air Force commanding general. Don't go bothering him." It was entirely absurd. I was the one who designed half the security protocols for this very building. I knew exactly which heavily armed guards were stationed behind which walls. I knew who was carrying concealed weapons and who was a civilian guest. I had personally briefed the Air Force commanding general on 3 separate occasions that year. I had his direct line saved in my secure phone. Yet my father was treating me like a street urchin trying to sneak under a fence at a private club. He wasn't worried about military etiquette. He was terrified of humiliation. He was desperate to ensure I never forgot my place as a subordinate in his imaginary kingdom, a kingdom built entirely on my money, my clearance, and my silence. I detached his hand from my blazer finger by finger, peeling his grip loose without breaking eye contact. I turned and walked in the opposite direction. The Air Force commanding general saw me across the room, nodded, and raised his glass in acknowledgement. My father did not see this. He was too busy straightening his own tie in the reflection of a glass display case, admiring his borrowed importance. The pressure cooker reached critical temperature at a Joint Base Security Summit. The event was a high-priority interagency coordination exercise, the kind of operation where a single miscommunication could compromise national security assets across 3 continents. I had been briefing my team since 4 a.m. and had consumed 4 cups of black coffee before the sun came up. My father had insisted on attending, wearing a blazer he had purchased specifically for the occasion and a veteran's pin he had polished until it gleamed. I was walking ahead of him toward a highly restricted TS/SC. I cleared checkpoint. I needed to sync with the advanced recon team before the main convoy arrived. The perimeter was lined with heavily armed military police K9 units straining at their leashes and steel barricades that could stop a truck moving at 60 miles per hour. Concertina wire topped the outer fencing. Communications antennas rotated slowly on the rooftops above. It was my zone, my theater of operations. I had personally approved the deployment of every guard and every weapon system within a 3-mile radius. I took 2 steps toward the red-taped entryway. Suddenly my father lunged. He clamped both hands around my upper arm, digging his thumbs so deeply into my muscle that a dark bruise would form by nightfall. He jerked me backward with a force born of absolute hysteria. "Don't you dare step through there," he spat, his voice a frantic, razor-sharp hiss. "That's the general's area. The guards will shoot you. You don't understand the rules here." I stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with him. I gave him the dead, freezing stare of a soldier evaluating a hostile threat through the crosshairs. His face was entirely devoid of color. His skin had gone gray. His hands were violently trembling on my arm, and I could feel the vibration through the fabric of my uniform. He actually genuinely believed that a fully credentialed colonel with top-secret clearance was going to be gunned down or arrested for simply walking through a door that I had authorized the construction of. His brain fundamentally refused to process my reality. He had constructed such a towering fortress of denial that even the physical evidence pinned to my chest, the rank insignia, the unit patches, the security credentials clipped to my lapel, could not penetrate his delusion. He looked at all of it and saw nothing. I didn't waste a single breath arguing. I firmly gripped his wrist and peeled his fingers off my uniform one by one. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man his age, fueled by pure, irrational terror. I removed the last finger and released his hand. It dropped to his side. I turned my back to him and strode directly past the barricades. The 2 military police guards at the gate, both armed with sidearms and tactical rifles, instantly snapped to attention. Their boot heels clicked together like a gunshot as they rendered a flawless, razor-sharp salute. "Good afternoon, Colonel White," the senior guard said, his voice crisp and professional. I returned the salute without breaking stride. I left my father paralyzed on the civilian side of the barrier, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, desperately trying to mentally erase what he had just witnessed. A civilian liaison standing nearby turned to one of the guards after I passed and asked in a low voice who I was. The guard kept his eyes forward and responded without hesitation. "That's Colonel White, sir. She runs this entire operation." My father heard every word. I didn't need to see his face. I could feel his world fracturing behind me. The sound of it was a silence louder than any bomb I had ever survived. I walked into the command center, pulled up the briefing schedule on my tablet, and began the day's operations as if nothing had happened. Because for me, nothing unusual had happened. I had simply walked through a door that belonged to me. He genuinely believed I was a criminal in my own command center, physically bruising my arm to keep me subjugated. If you've ever had to suppress your own power just to survive a toxic parent's delusions, drop a like and share your story in the comments below. The ultimate punishment is about to unfold. That brings us back to the lobby of the Defense Convention Center. The echo of his scream, "The military police will handcuff you," hung in the air like smoke from a detonation. The elite crowd watched us. High-ranking officers in decorated dress uniforms, civilian defense contractors in tailored suits, Pentagon liaisons with classified earpieces, all of them staring at the hysterical old man gripping his daughter's arm in the most secure lobby in the country. My father stood there, chest heaving, a vein pulsing visibly in his forehead, playing the role of the righteous civilian saving his stupid daughter from federal prison. His grip on my arm was white-knuckled. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple and disappeared into the starched collar of his shirt. I could feel the heat of his palm through my sleeve. I didn't offer a single word of defense. Words are cheap. 2 decades under live fire taught me that action is the only weapon that leaves a permanent scar. I maintained a terrifying graveyard stillness. The lobby went silent. The ambient hum of the building's ventilation system became the only sound. Every officer, every dignitary, every security detail froze in place watching. I reached into my coat pocket. I didn't rush. I didn't look angry. I didn't blink. I was executing a protocol. My fingers wrapped around the Department of Defense encrypted key fob, the device that controlled the entire executive transport convoy assigned to my command. I pulled it out slowly, deliberately, letting the overhead fluorescent lights catch the official emblem engraved on its titanium surface. I extended my arm, pointed the fob directly at the massive black armored SUV idling in the classified security perimeter, and pressed the button. The headlights of the beast flashed twice, sharp, blinding. The heavy bulletproof passenger doors popped open with a sharp pneumatic hiss that sliced through the dead silence of the lobby like a blade. The sound bounced off the marble walls and echoed down the corridor. Every head in the room snapped toward the vehicle. My father froze. His hand went limp and fell away from my arm like a severed limb. His jaw dropped open. His eyes went wider than I had ever seen them, the whites showing all the way around. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Nothing. Not a syllable. Major Alan Moreno, the commander of the MP unit. A man who had survived 3 kinetic deployments by my side. A man who had pulled shrapnel out of his own leg in the field and kept fighting, stepped out of the vehicle. His boots hit the polished concrete with authority that shook the floor. He adjusted his beret with one hand and ignored the gasping old man standing next to me as if he were invisible. He marched straight toward me, his posture rigid, his face locked in the iron expression of a soldier reporting to his commanding officer. He slammed his boots together with a crack that echoed through the entire lobby and snapped a textbook salute so sharp it could have cut steel. Reporting to Colonel White, the perimeter has been secured. The escort team is standing by for the commander's orders. The words, Colonel and Commander, hung in the air, dropping onto my father's head like artillery shells. Every official in the lobby heard them. Every security officer heard them. A 3-star general standing near the registration desk lowered his reading glasses and stared at my father with the quiet, lethal disapproval reserved for civilians who embarrass themselves in uniform territory. 2 Pentagon liaisons exchanged a glance and shook their heads. A female brigadier general near the elevator doors crossed her arms and watched the scene unfold with a thin, knowing smile. The 2 words rewrote the entire scene in a single breath. The hysterical old man who had been screaming about military police and handcuffs was not protecting his daughter from a crime. He was the only person in the room who didn't know who I was. My father's face contorted through a hyperspeed cycle of shock, horrific realization, and absolute psychological collapse. The color drained from his skin and then flooded back in a violent, blotchy red flush. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the polished floor. His jaw hung open, trying to form words that didn't exist in any language. His hands shook at his sides like leaves in a storm. He looked at Moreno. He looked at the armored SUV with its doors gaping open, the reinforced interior gleaming under the lobby lights. He looked at the rank insignia on my chest that he had spent 41 years refusing to see. The insignia he had dismissed, ignored, denied, erased. It was all real. Every ribbon, every medal, every star. I held his gaze for one solitary, freezing second. I let him feel the full crushing weight of his own ignorance. Then I turned to Major Moreno. Good. Initiate deployment. My voice was calm, measured the voice of a woman who had given 10,000 orders and never raised it once. I walked past my father, the heels of my dress shoes clicking against the marble floor, each step a controlled detonation. The crowd parted for me without being asked. Officers straightened their posture as I passed. A civilian contractor stepped aside and lowered his head. My father stood frozen in the center of the lobby, surrounded by people who now understood exactly who he was and exactly who I was. The distance between us grew with every step I took. 10 feet, 20, 30. I did not slow down. Moreno fell in behind me without a word, matching my pace stride for stride. The armored doors sealed shut behind us with a final pneumatic thud that echoed through the marble corridor. I climbed into the vehicle and settled into the reinforced leather seat. Moreno closed the door and tapped the roof twice. The convoy began to move. I did not look back. I never looked back. I didn't expect congratulations the next morning. I expected silence or maybe avoidance. I expected him to pretend the entire event had never happened, the way he had pretended my promotions never happened, the way he had pretended my combat tours were routine office work, the way he had pretended for 41 years that his daughter was a nobody. But his cowardice was nauseating even by his standards. I drove to his house at 7 a.m. to pack the rest of my personal gear that I had stored in the guest bedroom closet. Uniforms, documents, a box of personal effects I'd left behind years ago and never retrieved. I found him huddled at the kitchen table, still in the same wrinkled shirt from the night before. He was staring at a mug of cold coffee that he hadn't touched. The bitter smell of stale grounds hung in the air like a fog. Harsh morning sunlight cut through the kitchen window, exposing every wrinkle on his face, every line carved by decades of fraudulent superiority. The newspaper sat untouched on the counter. The television was off for the first time I could remember. The second I walked in, there was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no remorse, no embarrassment offered in my direction. His face twisted into a mask of bitter resentment, as if I had wronged him. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the mug and sending a splash of cold coffee across the wood surface. He snarled, "You made me look like a fool in front of everyone?" I stopped packing. I set the folded uniform shirt in my hands down on the counter, aligning its edges precisely, and turned to face him. I stood at parade rest feet, shoulder width apart, hands clasped behind my back. I kept my voice low, controlled, and lethal. "I made you look like a fool. I simply unlocked the door of a vehicle the Department of Defense assigned to me. You made yourself look like a fool." His nostrils flared. He gripped the edges of the kitchen table with both hands, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood. "You should have warned me," he stammered, his voice pitching upward, grasping at straws in a desperate bid to shift the blame onto my shoulders. I stepped closer, closing the distance to 3 feet. I could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes from a sleepless night. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, mixed with the sour tang of a man whose entire identity had been disassembled in public, and he had no tools to rebuild it. "Warn you about what? That the daughter you despise is actually the one giving orders to that entire base. I told you 100 times about my position. But you chose to cover your eyes and ears, because your narrow mind couldn't accept that the daughter you constantly step on is the one with the power of life and death." The truth hit him dead center. His face flushed bright red from his collar to his hairline. His lower lip trembled. His script, the one he had rehearsed all night, the one where he played the victim and I played the ungrateful child, was ruined. He had nowhere to hide. The kitchen was too small, the sunlight was too bright, and his lies were too thin to survive another second in the open air. He gripped the edge of the table and tried to push back, but his arms were shaking too badly to generate force. He finally shoved himself upright so fast that the chair toppled backward, cracking against the kitchen wall and leaving a dent in the drywall. The cold coffee mug slid across the table and stopped at the edge, teetering. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door with shaking hands, fumbling with the zipper, yanking at it 3 times before it caught. His breathing was ragged, uneven, the breathing of a man whose entire defense had been dismantled in under 60 seconds. He stormed toward the front entrance. He threw one last venomous look over his shoulder, his lip curling with a hatred that had been fermenting for decades. "You've become too cold-blooded. You chose your job over your family." I picked up my duffel bag from the floor and threw the strap over my shoulder. The weight of it was familiar, the same weight I'd carried on my back across deserts and mountain passes and burning cities for 20 years. No, I am choosing to never have to apologize to my family just for being exceptional. I walked out behind him, leaving the front door wide open. The morning air rushed in and scattered the newspaper pages off the kitchen counter. They floated to the linoleum floor and settled there like fallen flags. The cold coffee mug finally tipped off the edge of the table and shattered on the floor. I heard the ceramic crack behind me as I stepped off the porch. I didn't flinch. I got into my car, placed the duffel bag on the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway for the last time. I passed the luxury sedan parked along the curb, the one my combat pay had funded, the chrome trim still gleaming. I did not slow down. Predictably, the pack of wolves mobilized. My phone screen lit up with a call from my Uncle David before I'd even merged onto the highway. I answered it on speaker while navigating traffic, keeping both hands on the wheel. "You know how your father is, he's getting old. He feels like he was stabbed in the back." David said, his voice dripping with condescending guilt. He used that tone, the one where elderly relatives wrap manipulation in a blanket of fake concern and expect you to fold. I kept my eyes on the road, watching the white lane lines disappear under my tires one by one. He stabbed himself. David sighed heavily on the other end. I could hear him shifting in his recliner, the leather creaking under his weight. I could hear a television murmuring in the background. He was calling from his living room, comfortable, detached, inserting himself into a situation he had never bothered to understand. Even if you are a Colonel family is still number one. You need to come home and apologize. The audacity was staggering. They were weaponizing bloodlines to force me to my knees in front of my own abuser. They demanded I apologize for surviving his humiliation. David had sat in that living room at every Thanksgiving for 20 years. He had watched my father introduce me as a paper pusher. He had watched him take my money and claim credit for my career. He had watched him grab my arm at military events and physically restrain me from doing my job. David had seen all of it, and he had chosen silence every single time. Now, the moment my father's comfort was threatened, David had found his voice. The entire family had witnessed decades of his behavior. They had seen him dismiss me at every holiday, mock my career at every gathering, and take my money without a single word of thanks. And now they wanted me to crawl back and restore the peace, not because peace was just, but because my absence made their lives uncomfortable. My father's misery was becoming their problem, and they wanted me to absorb it so they didn't have to. I didn't yell. I didn't explain the psychological toll of a lifetime of erasure. I didn't recite the list of injuries, the bruises, the public humiliations, the decades of stolen identity. Explaining myself to David would have been like filing an after-action report for an enemy combatant. It would change nothing, and it would give him ammunition to use against me later. I simply ended the call and blocked the number. The barrage of text messages from cousins and aunts hit my phone within minutes, all demanding I restore the fake peace, all using the same language as if they had held a conference call to coordinate their attack. I turned the phone on silent and dropped it into the center console. The screen kept flashing with notifications. I kept driving. I treated this like a hostile insurgency. You don't argue with insurgents. You cut off their supply lines. I pulled into the parking garage of my secure facility, walked straight to my office, locked the door, and logged into the military network. I sat at my desk with the cold efficiency of a surgeon and pulled up every active authorization I had ever filed on his behalf. The list was longer than I expected. I had been quietly propping up his access for over a decade without keeping a running count. VIP passes to 3 separate military installations, a guest security clearance for Pentagon-adjacent events, a standing invitation to the annual Armed Forces Ball filed under my name, an anonymous financial sponsorship through a Veterans Assistance Fund that I had personally funded with my own money to cover his membership dues at 2 organizations he believed were prestigious. I revoked them all. Every credential, every clearance, every invisible thread that connected Robert White to the world of power he worshipped was severed with a series of keystrokes. Each deletion took less than 5 seconds. Years of access gone. Without me acting as his invisible shield, Robert White was instantly exposed to the brutal reality of his actual social standing, which was none at all. He was a retired administrative clerk whose most significant professional achievement was filing paperwork on time for a regional office that had since been closed. 2 weeks later, he attempted to attend a prestigious veterans gala. He drove up in the luxury sedan I had paid for, the chrome still gleaming from his meticulous polishing. He stepped out wearing a charcoal suit my combat pay had funded, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked up to the checkpoint expecting the red carpet. Instead, the security detail ran his ID through the system, stared at the screen for a long moment, shook their heads, and coldly informed him that his credentials had been revoked. They escorted him off the premises with firm professional indifference. He screamed my name in the parking lot. His voice bounced off the concrete walls of the parking structure, hollow and desperate, and entirely without authority. The guards exchanged glances and shrugged. One of them covered his mouth to hide a laugh. Another folded his arms and watched until the old man stopped yelling and simply stood there, panting, staring at the closed gate. Nobody came to help him. Nobody called me to intervene. His borrowed power evaporated into thin air, and nobody in that parking lot cared enough about Robert White to even ask him if he was all right. He was forced back into his reality, a retired administrative clerk with no connections, no credentials, and no daughter willing to prop up his costume anymore. entirely forgotten by the world he worshipped. I monitored the security feed from my office 200 miles away. I watched his tiny figure on the grainy screen, standing alone in an empty parking lot under fluorescent lights, arms hanging at his sides. He stood there for almost 3 minutes before he got back in his car. I closed the laptop and went back to work. 2 months of absolute silence drove him insane. I was sitting alone in a classified briefing room, reviewing operational documents under the harsh blue light of a secure workstation. The room hummed with the low drone of air filtration systems. The walls were bare except for a digital clock and a classification warning poster. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. An email pinged on my secure tablet. The sender address was unfamiliar, routed through a civilian server, but I recognized the writing style after the first sentence. The cadence, the self-pity, the theatrical grammar of a man who had spent his entire life performing victimhood. It was a massive, rambling manifesto from my father. 5 full paragraphs of carefully constructed emotional manipulation. I scanned the text, my jaw tightening with each line. "You've changed since you got a little power," he wrote. "I regret the misunderstanding that day, but you treated me like trash. Regardless, I am still your father. The command of blood is higher than the command of the military. I forgive you. Come home." He was actually offering me forgiveness. I read the line again. "I forgive you. Come home." The sentence sat on the screen like a loaded weapon pointed in the wrong direction. The man who had publicly humiliated me for 4 decades, who had physically bruised my arm at a joint base checkpoint, who had screamed at me like a criminal in front of the nation's top military officials, who had introduced me to strangers as a paper pusher while spending every dollar I bled for in combat zones he couldn't locate on a map, was offering me forgiveness. He had not listed a single thing he was sorry for. He had not acknowledged the bruise, the screaming, the decades of erasure. He had simply decided that enough time had passed and that I should come home and resume funding his delusion. I pushed the tablet away from me and pressed the heels of my palms against my closed eyes. The air system droned on. The fluorescent light buzzed above my head, a tiny persistent vibration I could feel in my teeth. I sat there for a full minute, alone in the silence, listening to the empty room press against me. General Marissa Cole. My mentor and strategic advisor walked into the briefing room carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. The smell of fresh grounds cut through the stale air. She set 1 mug in front of me without asking, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. She noticed the tension in my jaw, the way my shoulders had climbed toward my ears. She raised an eyebrow. I summarized the email in 3 flat sentences. She took a sip of her coffee, set the mug down on the mahogany table with a deliberate tap, and looked at me with eyes that had seen decades of warfare and 1,000 soldiers trying to reconcile duty with family. She leaned against the edge of the table and crossed her arms. "I told you, Colonel. Blood doesn't automatically generate loyalty. Sometimes the comrade who shares half a sip of water in a trench with you is your real family. What are you going to do?" Her words were a lifeline. She stripped away the civilian guilt and replaced it with tactical clarity. She wasn't telling me to hate my father. She was telling me to stop punishing myself for his weakness. She was giving me permission to walk away from a war I had already won. I looked down at the glowing screen. I read the email 1 final time, slowly, word by word. There was no remorse in his sentences, only a desperate, pathetic attempt to drag me back into my cage so he could repair his shattered ego. Every apology was a trap. Every concession was a new leash. Engaging with him would only feed his delusion. I looked back up at General Cole. "Nothing at all." She nodded once, a single firm movement of her chin. She took another sip of her coffee and walked out of the room without another word. I selected the email. My finger hovered over the delete key for exactly 1 second, not out of hesitation, but out of finality. I wanted to remember this moment, the last moment I would ever spend a single calorie of energy on Robert White's opinion of me. I hit delete and permanently purged the trash folder. The screen went dark for a moment, then refreshed to the default classification screen. I pushed the tablet aside and opened the next operational briefing. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Lighter. I picked up the coffee General Cole had brought me and took a sip. It was still warm. It was the best cup of coffee I had ever tasted. Time passed, and my career exploded forward. I now command the halls of the Pentagon with zero hesitation and absolute authority. My name is on documents that shape the security posture of the nation. Last week, Lieutenant Rachel, a brilliant young intelligence officer with sharp instincts, a classified commendation on her record, and a spine made of steel, sat across from me in my office crying uncontrollably. Her family had spent the weekend mocking her rank at a backyard barbecue. Her older brother had called her a government secretary. Her mother had asked when she was going to get a real job. Her father had told the neighbors she answered phones at an army office. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked up at me. Her mascara was smeared, her voice cracked. "Boss, how do I get my father to acknowledge me? How do I make him see who I really am?" I put my pen down on the desk and locked eyes with her. I recognized the look on her face. It was the same look I'd worn standing in a kitchen doorway at 17, waiting for a man to look up from his newspaper. I had carried that look across oceans and deserts and into rooms full of powerful men who saluted me while my father refused to. I had let that look eat me alive for 2 decades before I learned how to set it down. Rachel deserved to learn that lesson faster than I did. I gave her the exact truth I'd bled to learn. You don't need his acknowledgement, Lieutenant. Your family's weakness in the face of your strength is their problem, not yours. Build a fortress of self-respect from within. You are already a giant. Don't chop off your own legs just to fit into the pants they force you to wear. I watched her spine straighten as the words took hold. She swallowed hard, blinked the last of the tears away, and stood up. She saluted me with precision and walked out of my office with her shoulders squared and her chin level. I listened to her boots clicking down the corridor until the sound faded. Then I went back to my paperwork. Yesterday I walked into a sterile nursing home on the outskirts of the city. The antiseptic smell hit me the moment I pushed through the double glass doors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, pale glow on everything. A wheelchair squeaked down the corridor ahead of me, pushed by an orderly in pale blue scrubs who nodded without smiling. The linoleum floor was polished to a dull shine. I followed the room numbers until I reached the last door at the end of the hallway. I stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. My father was 83 years old, shriveled, confined to a wheelchair, stripped of all his vain illusions. The luxury sedan was gone, repossessed years ago, when the payments I had been covering silently were cut off. The country club membership had lapsed. The neighbors had stopped calling. The friends who had laughed at his jokes and admired his car had disappeared the moment his utility ran out. He sat beneath a thin blanket in a room that smelled of industrial soap and boiled vegetables. A plastic cup of water sat on his bedside tray next to an untouched bowl of applesauce. He stared up at my dress uniform, heavy with medals, rows of ribbons, and commendations covering the left side of my chest, from my shoulder to my heart. His eyes moved slowly across them, reading each one as if seeing a foreign language for the first time. His lips moved slightly, counting them. His voice trembled. "I am proud of you. The truth is, I was always terrified of you. I didn't know how to be a father when you were so much more exceptional than anything I ever achieved." It was the most honest thing he had ever said. The only honest thing. I watched his eyes fill with water, the tears pooling in the deep wrinkles around his lids, but not falling. His hands lay flat on the blanket, thin and spotted, trembling slightly with each breath. These were the same hands that had grabbed my arm in lobbies and yanked me behind pillars. They couldn't grip a coffee mug now. 20 years ago, I would have dropped to my knees and wept for that validation. I would have forgiven everything. I would have held his withered hand and told him it was okay, that none of it mattered, that we could start over. Now I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, quiet peace. The wound was closed. The scar was there, permanent, pressed into my skin like a brand, but it no longer bled. I looked down at him. "I know." 2 words. He closed his eyes and nodded slowly, his chin dipping toward his chest, as if a weight he had carried for decades had finally slid off and shattered on the floor. I didn't hug him. I didn't cry. I didn't tell him I forgave him, because forgiveness wasn't what this visit was about. This visit was about seeing the truth with my own eyes one final time so I could close the last door standing between me and permanent peace. I stood there for a moment, watching the afternoon light cut through the window blinds and fall across his blanket in thin, pale lines. His breathing was shallow, rhythmic, the breathing of a man who had finally stopped running from the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. I adjusted the collar of my dress uniform, turned, and walked out of the room. My boots clicked against the linoleum with the same steady cadence they carried across every terrain I had ever conquered. The orderly nodded at me again as I passed. I pushed through the double doors and stepped into the open air. The sky was clear. I took one deep breath and walked to my car. That armored SUV from all those years ago was never actually locked. I just needed the courage to rip the door open myself. I am Colonel Kathy White, and I will never apologize for my greatness ever again. Blood doesn't demand your submission, and true respect is built through resilience, not inherited through a toxic family tree. If this journey of reclaiming your ironclad self-worth resonated with you, please leave a like, subscribe for more true stories, and share how you finally set your boundaries in the comments below. Your internal fortress is yours alone to guard.